And thank you for starting the recording. That's fantastic. We'll be keeping everybody on mute and off video until we're in the breakout groups. Great. Well, I will introduce the panel who we're going to hear from in just a moment or two. But before I do, I'd just like to recognize where this event fits in the Shift to Power journey. We know that a growing movement of people is really challenging the traditional top-down nature in the ways of working and decision-making within international development aid and philanthropy. We know this as the Shift to Power movement, which calls for new behaviors, new mindsets and work approaches that really do shift power and resources, and most importantly, promote equitable and people-led development. There's a lot of energy in this movement. INTRAC's not alone in asking questions about what this really means in practice, providing both challenge and support to the sector to get more concrete and get more practical about it. We know that together with others in the sector, we need to do more to shift the power in practice, to work with partners to generate proactive ideas and generate practical approaches in order to shift power to civil society, organizations and communities. In this event, we'll explore how this may happen and actions that we can take to bring about change. So we're delighted to create this space to provide the opportunity to hear from experts in their field as they share their expertise and insights, both to inform us, but also to challenge us in ways that we can shift power through our organizations and our program approaches. So over the shape of the next 90 minutes together, we will hear from 4 expert speakers to start with, and then this will be followed by a short question and answer session. And we'll then move into small breakout groups to discuss any issues arising so that you all can share your own experiences and thoughts. And then we'll return to hear just from a selection of those groups to give a flavor of discussions. And then finally, there'll be some concluding remarks to summarize the key themes. So before I introduce the panel themselves, I'd just like to share the goals that we set ourselves for our session today. So first of all, what we want to do is to explore key issues in organizational development through the lens of shifting the power for civil society organizations. And this is really to recognize that all our lives as individuals and organizations are played out in a bigger arena of what's going on in the world around us. It's the same for all civil society organizations. The sum of all our efforts to bring about positive change individually and collectively can enable significant shift. In this event, we're going to hear about localizing consultancy, integrating organizational development in partnerships, feminist organizational development, and digital organizational development approaches. So the second goal is to mark INTRAC's 30th birthday. This is the reason. For 30 years, INTRAC has always sought to work alongside civil society and its many and varied organizations, meeting them where they are to support and strengthen locally led action. I wrote a blog earlier this year to commemorate INTRAC's 30th birthday, but really it's also to celebrate civil society more generally and reflect on its wider successes and challenges of which we've been a part.
Peter, sorry to interrupt. I think your mic is picking up some background noise. Let's make it hard to hear you. That's better.
So as we celebrate our birthday, really what we're wanting to do is to share the passion that INTRAC's always had for strengthening civil society. That is what brought the founders together of INTRAC in 1991, and it's really what animates INTRAC today. So on that note, I'd like to introduce the expert speakers. In brief, first of all, Rick James, an organizational change specialist who's worked with INTRAC since the early days, and is also a senior lecturer at Bayes Business School, the University of London. Also, Angela Zamaere Smith, who has over 20 years experience in international development and began her career in Malawi. She's currently Director of Programs and Partnerships at All We Can. Nancy Akanbombire is a Programs and Capacity Building Specialist with a strong background in monitoring, evaluation and learning. She has significant experience in gender and development, research, policy analysis and participatory community engagement. Lucy Morris is an organisational change specialist with over 20 years in the sector, and she is one of INTRAC's principal consultants. She's worked in both the humanitarian and development contexts, both in the UK and overseas. I'd also like to introduce Smruti Patel. So she's not on the panel, but Smruti will be providing the concluding remarks for us. She is a long-time advocate for shifting the power and well known in this sphere. And we're delighted that she's part of the INTRAC board. And she's also co-director of the Global Mentoring Initiative, and we'll hear from her later. So as Rick gets ready to start us off, please can I remind everybody to write questions in and comments and reflections in the chat so that our moderators who are working behind the scene can help me pick out questioned areas that we'll be able to ask back to the panel during the question and answer session in due course. So on that note, can I hand over to you, Rick?
Great, thank you, Peter. So looking back on 30 years of INTRAC, I think one of the things that makes me most proud is the efforts that we've put into localizing OD consultancy. For me, it started 25 years ago in Malawi, where I went to work and train a team of young Malawians to provide OD services to the emerging civil society there. And it's lovely to see Angela Zamaere Smith, who's going to come and talk in a minute. She was one of the early cohorts, as well as a couple of other people on the call. Since then, INTRAC's also done face-to-face training programs for OD consultants from Kyrgyzstan, from Lebanon, from Palestine, from Indonesia, from Saudi Arabia, from Malaysia, from Mali, all over the world. It's something very, very close to our heart. When I look back on some of those early days, I do shudder when I think of I think of the quality of work, how little I knew about OD, and also how little I still know today when thinking about organizational change and the complexities of making that happen. But as I say, the thing that makes me proud is I think we put a finger on what is or what was a critical issue and still is today, because I think good practice, capacity strengthening requires a quality supply of national consultants who know the context, who speak the language, who are on hand to provide follow through. And 3 recent studies by foundations that I read last year, Hewlett, Packard and others, confirmed that in many parts of the world, not in all parts of the world, but in many places, there is a critical bottleneck. And for me, OD is about change in individual organizations, but it's also about change in the ecosystem, the supply and the accessibility of national consultants to civil society sectors. It's not about international consultants flying in and flying out. That's unsustainable on so many levels. And it also keeps the power and privilege firmly rooted in Europe and North America. So in 2022, at the start of 2022, you know, in one sense, I feel slightly embarrassed because INTRAC's still singing the same song. It feels almost like a stuck record, but we feel that localizing the supply of OD consultants is still critical. So we're very proudly supporting Well Grounded, which is a Cameroonian-based organization, as they develop and deliver a Facilitators for Change program. And we're just providing backstopping support and some mentoring and materials, but they're leading the whole thing. We're also co-creating a program together with some regional providers and 4 foundations to have consultants for change programs in 4 regions over the next 4 years. And as we look ahead to those programs, I think for me, it sort of highlights the importance of embedding 3 key learnings. The first one for me in any formation program is that recruitment is absolutely key. You know, the raw material is almost more important than the program itself. And so it is about looking for people with competence, with skills, but I think experience has taught me that it's looking for more than that. It's looking for people with commitment to remain serving civil society and a real calling to serve civil society. So as well as recruitment, I think it is about a variety of experiential learning methods. You know, we've seen that modular programs help because we don't learn everything all at once. They have to be highly applied. Practical assignments with mentoring support can be really, really helpful. And increasingly using a hybrid mix of both online learning as well as face-to-face learning. And the third key area that we will want to embed in all our future work is what we call consulting with soul. It's not about creating a whole cohort of briefcase experts who can go around and write reports, but it's what we call consultants with soul. So what on earth does that mean? For us, it means 4 key things. We're looking for people who focus on the change in the client, not the contract. It's not just about earning an income or fulfilling a terms of reference. It has to make a practical difference on the ground. The second thing, it's about consultants who relentlessly prioritize client ownership. We've learned again and again and again and again the importance of ownership. You can't impose lasting change from outside. So good consultants have to cultivate this sort of fragile flower of ownership. The third element of consulting with soul is really helping people to have the courage and the emotional intelligence to get to the heart of the matter, not just to deal with what's on the surface or the presenting problem, but really to engage with what's underneath the surface. And the fourth element would be about consultants with the self-discipline to bring the very best of themselves to every assignment. And that means keeping themselves fit mentally, emotionally, spiritually, physically, so that really they are at the top of their game, because OD is so difficult to do well. So as we celebrate INTRAC's 30 years and look ahead, hopefully to another 30 years, what I think I would love people to say of INTRAC would be that we inspired a generation of consultants who really catalyze positive change in civil society around the world. Thank you.
Thank you for those insights, Rick. That's great to hear. So without further ado, we're going to jump to the next speaker to hear from them. And can I take the opportunity to remind you to put in your thoughts, reflections in the chat. We are going to be collecting those and putting questions back to the panel after their brief presentations. Okay, so next up is Angela, over to you.
Thank you so much for inviting me today. And first of all, congratulations to INTRAC for 30 years of transforming people and organizations. What a great achievement. And as Rick said, I was one of the first cohort of INTRAC OD trainees in Malawi. This training and practice, which happened 25 years ago, transformed me as a person and as a practitioner. For me, Rick has been an OD guru, and I've sought wisdom from him in my practice throughout my career. I've used this OD approach in all my subsequent work with organizations such as Tier Fund and the Natural Resource Governance Institute, where the common thread in my portfolios has been the capacity strengthening of local civil society organizations in various sectors across Africa, South Asia and the Asia Pacific, Latin America and Eurasia. I'm now the Director of Programs and Partnerships at All We Can, a medium-sized UK NGO whose vision is to see every person's potential fulfilled. We focus on serving the world's most marginalized communities, and we are rooted in the Christian faith. All We Can works through partnership alongside our global neighbors most impacted by disasters, poverty and injustice to enable flourishing and resilient communities. In 2014, we engaged Rick at INTRAC to help us think through how we could do development differently, putting partners and crucially partnership at the very heart of all that we do. 7 years later, we can proudly say that we are led by the priorities and development agendas of our partners and the communities that they serve. We work to help partners to fulfill their mission. So that means that our partnerships are based on relationship, not projects. We don't have a sector focus, but are led by the needs that partners identify in their communities. We provide flexible and unrestricted funding to cover both partner programs as well as their organization development. We commit to these partnerships for up to 15 years and aim to leave partners resilient and in a stronger place than when we find them. We recognize that when we start a partnership, the organization has already been on a journey, and we aim to make a net positive contribution as a partner and a critical friend for part of their journey, realizing that when we do exit, these organizations must then continue to meet the development needs of their own communities for many more decades to come. So for all we can, partnerships begin with an exploration phase where we get to know one another with our partners and ensure that there's congruence in vision and values. This is followed up by a comprehensive facilitated organization assessment for partners to identify their own gaps and their OD priorities, which leads to the development of an OD plan, which all we can then support. We don't tend to be involved in the OA processes because we want partners to be as honest with themselves as possible. So we work with a network of trusted OD consultants in our priority countries. As Rick said, sometimes finding the right consultants has been a real challenge. Our MOU then with our partners begins with their strategies, not projects, and the grants that we then provide are based on annual operations plans that stem from these strategies. There's an equal emphasis on OD as there is on programs. And in some years, we found that partners spend more on their OD and their organizational sustainability activities than on community projects. Because for us at All We Can, capacity development is an end in itself and not just a means to an end. We are grateful that we can work in this way because the majority of our funding is also unrestricted from churches, individuals, trusts, and foundations. And so we can actually chart a different path. So we're continuing to deepen our partnership and OD approach. And annually, we measure the health of partnership with our partners through anonymous partner surveys and through partner workshops where we use a tool that we have developed jointly. It has indicators that partners identified as characteristics of a healthy partnership, and we score one another on how we're doing. The value is in the rich conversations that ensue and the commitments made to change and be better partners, rather than the scores themselves. And this helps us, it helps to keep us humble, honest, learning, and growing. All We Can merged with YK International last year, and we're exploring how these approaches can be embraced across this side of our combined movement as well. So we're continuing to change internally, becoming facilitators, enablers, and catalysts for change for others, and positioning ourselves to be in the forefront of the decolonizing aid, shift to the power, and locally led development agendas here in the UK. So I'll stop here for now. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much, Angela. Really interesting to hear about that commitment over such a long time to make the change happen, and in those partnerships that you have set up at All We Can. Really good. Okay, thank you. So before we go to our next speaker, can I just remind people again, please do put your thoughts, reflections, questions in the chat that we'll try and summarize and pose back to the panel in due course. So delighted then to introduce Nancy, who's going to talk to us more about feminist organizational development. Over to you, Nancy.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you to the first two speakers. Just to re-echo what Angela said about your 30th anniversary, to congratulate you first of all on 30 years of amazing work, and for putting together such a space for insightful discussions. So I am picking it from a feminist angle, and I reflected on OD and the theme for INTRAC celebration, Shifting Power. And I couldn't erase the fact that this all starts with our processes, shift in our own processes, in our own approaches. And I think that there's some internal work that needs to be done before the bigger shift happens. And as everything feminist organizational development basically applies feminist principles into our approaches and practices. And so how is power interrogated in our processes and in our OD approaches, recruiting consultancies, going into our communities and the people that we work with. As feminists, we place patriarchy at the center of our analysis, how that unfolds and manifests and kind of replicates the various forms of inequalities within our spaces, within our approaches, within our methods. And I liked when Rick mentioned consulting with soul. That got me into thinking about Hope Chikudu and Brido Chikudu's manual on strategies to building organizations with a soul. And I'll recommend that as a resource that we can look at. But I was also looking at organizations, and I picked up a definition of organization, just the word organizations, by Jessica Horn in the Sussex Institute for Development Studies. And she says an organization is a social unit of people that are structured and managed to meet a particular need or pursue a particular goal. And that kept me thinking, it brought me back to something that is written in Hope Chikudu's manual on strategies to build organizations with a soul, where she speaks of the fact that organizations are like living beings. And I think that we can keep that in mind as we move towards this theme of shifting power. Now, two key things resonate with me in Jessica Horn's definition of an organization: structured and managed. Very often, our OD processes are backed by this edge of to achieve results, outcomes, and all. And I think that little cognizance is placed on the people that make up organizations, first of all, the people that contribute to the growth of these organizations. How are they structured? How are they managed? And now I think that what is important in terms of feminist approaches or feminist OD is our ability to examine and question power within our processes, our ability to subvert what is considered normal. And Rick also said something around singing the same song. I think that we have been singing the same song for a long time. And I think that it's important that we subvert what is considered normal, our traditional approaches, our traditional OD practices, so that can change how power is examined. I mean, how power is exercised, how power is used in our organizations. I think that it's very difficult, it's complicated. This whole theme about shifting power is complicated. But I think that it also starts with, as I said, the individual, how we are intentional about our own unconscious biases, how these biases sometimes indirectly support the existing power dynamics in our organizations. So for me, the question is how. We have talked about this. There are spaces, and just to echo Rick again, he says, we have been singing the same song for far too long, but I think that there are some baby steps we can take. We can start to engage in very honest conversations around the issues of power in our organizations. We can begin to engage in conversations around power and our OD practices, our OD methods. This can be done. We take this from an individual level because, as I said, it's complicated. Let's take it from an individual level. We bring it down to the collective level. See how we can have cross-team discussions on the issues of let's create spaces in our processes, our methods, in our different people with different forms of power, supported, guided to share their perspective equally and in very respectful ways. And I think that we have to be very inclusive. We have to be diverse and very intersectional in our OD practices. I don't think we can actually shift. I don't think we can actually change when a category of people are excluded. So I think that it is important that we look at change in a very intersectional way. And just to, my last point is around the fact that we have to learn. And in the process of that learning, I think that there's some unlearning to be done. And just to say that I think it's time to flip the script, because if we have been singing the same song for a long time, we need to flip the script. We need to sing the song differently. So I'll also end here and wait for questions later. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nancy, for that challenge about really our own biases and supporting existing systems. Really interesting to hear. I'm sure I can see various bits of chat you won't have had a chance to see yet, but we'll try and bring that to you in a question in due course. So again, just a reminder for everyone, please do write your thoughts, reflections, responses to that so we can pose questions back to the panel in due course. So our final panelist is Lucy Morris. So I'll hand over to you, Lucy, and Lucy's going to talk to us about digital organizational development approaches for shifting the power. Over to you, Lucy.
Thanks very much, Peter. Really enjoying the discussion so far. So we're going to travel back in time. So are you ready? So please close your eyes or lower your gaze and imagine you're going back in time 2 years to late March 2020. What's happening around you? What are you doing? How are you feeling? Okay, please return to 2022. Reopen your eyes again. So I'm guessing you were briefly transported back to the start of the pandemic and remembering the disruptive impact it had on you, your family, your friends, and also your work. And if COVID-19 has taught us nothing else, it's that individuals and organizations had to rapidly shift how they communicated and worked. And lots of those shifts were digital. We learned to shift processes online and to keep in touch remotely, whether it was taking part in local COVID-19 WhatsApp groups, homeschooling kids, getting to grips with Zoom calls with colleagues, or discovering new software like Jamboard to help us collaborate remotely. And whilst acknowledging all of the pain and the suffering that the pandemic continues to cause, it's also fair to say that the last 2 years have done more for digital organizational development, or digital OD, than ever before. And one of the really positive benefits of that new digital landscape is a more fertile environment for shifting the power within international development and humanitarian response. In 1990, 0.5% of the world's population was online. Today, more than 30 years later, nearly half of the world's entire population of 7.7 billion people is online, and social media platforms are used by 1 in 3 people around the world. Now, obviously, while in some countries there's much lower levels of internet use than in others, increasingly citizens expect to be able to access services online. And this is really significant for the Shifting the Power movement, because its ultimate goal is not just to shift more decision-making, more funding, and more power to national NGOs, but to shift more decision-making and control to those communities most impacted by issues such as poverty, racial injustice, and climate change. Communities are increasingly demanding more voice, more accountability, more transparency when it comes to the services they receive, and digital organizational development is an important tool to help them get it. A good example of a new digital native organization is called Loop. It was set up to collect digital feedback from citizens impacted by conflict or natural disasters and feed this back to the organizations which are responding to the emergency. It's already working in the Philippines and has just set up in Poland. Anyone who can access a mobile phone will be able to share their story via WhatsApp, Facebook, Messenger, or directly on a web platform. And aid organizations can then respond to those individual stories and improve their services in real time. Digital OD also means helping more established organizations, such as Red Cross and Red Crescent movement members, to remain relevant and responsive to communities' needs through a process of digital transformation. So this involves shifting the skills, the software, the hardware, but also the culture of an organization. And that means shifting the power internally. So one example of this is, for example, reducing hierarchy and enabling more distributed decision-making and leadership. So digital OD opens up huge opportunities to shift power within the sector and in our own organisations, but the challenges are also very real. So the digital divide remains, and digital OD can unintentionally reinforce and amplify existing inequalities by only enabling those members of the community with access to a phone or internet and electricity to engage, for example. It may also exclude older staff or volunteers who are less confident with new technology and software. Data protection is also an issue, particularly where sensitive data is being collected and may be hacked. But despite all these challenges, opportunities for more open, accountable, and collaborative ways of working and for shifting the power through digital OD continue to grow. Stephen Bartlett, who is a famous entrepreneur and investor, said just yesterday, a lot of businesses are resistant to change. But regardless of what industry or country you work in, there is a bulldozer called innovation, and it doesn't care how much you love your job or how hard you've worked, it's going to run you over. And that bulldozer is now increasing in speed in the digital world. So creating a philosophy and a culture within your business for change, embracing it, enjoying it, and seeing it as an opportunity is a winning formula. So at INTRAC, we talk a lot about organisational readiness for change. And I'm wondering how many organisations are really ready to shift power through digital organisational development. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Lucy. I've left with this image of a bulldozer in my mind at the end of that. Yeah, bring on the innovation. Excellent. Thank you very much, everybody, for putting your thoughts and chats and reflections in the chat of the Zoom. Much appreciated. I'm just going to now, I've got a few questions that we've collated just to ask back to the panel. I think, Rick, not just probably because you started, there's been a few reflections on what you said and start there. Moving on from quite a lot of comments about your consulting with soul comment. But actually the angle that I thought would be interesting to take on this would be about balance. So the question is, how can we make organizational development as local as possible, but as international as necessary? What kind of practical steps could be made to move in that direction?
Yes, it's a good question. I suppose that's often the tension INTRAC faces in all of our consultancy requests that come to us, and every situation is different. You know, I think the consultancies that I've probably enjoyed most have been when I've worked alongside someone from the country and context. Certainly for me as someone international, but also absolutely delighted. I was telling you about the Well-Grounded initiative that talks about facilitators for change, and absolutely delighted that they're the ones completely leading on it. So it's sort of nationally led, and INTRAC's role is very much in the background. So yes, so I think that, you know, that's the challenge. The question that we have to live with and grapple with is to make it you know, as local as is effective for the ultimate clients.
Well, thank you very much, Rick. In fact, that's actually quite a good segue into another area of questioning, which I think I'm going to direct at Nancy, if that's okay, because it really relates to the things that you were talking about learning and unlearning, the need to change in ways, to change the ways that we talk about this. So that idea of developing and learning with local organizational development practitioners is very much part of that decolonization agenda, the white bias question. What kind of, how might these links be made more explicitly? How could we make this work?
I think we should stop assuming and know that knowledge exists at all levels and at all places. And so, as I said, it begins with the shift from where so it begins from, so if I am, so it's actually just, we should look at the privileges here. And in terms of localizing, so recently we had this program where, I mean, we had a flagship program where we delivered, and so, I mean, we are a funder and we have partners, and so we say we are equal, but just because you are funding, there's some power there. So we have programs, we design these activities, and we're like, oh, you are free to participate, but there's this thing around, if I don't participate, not that there's a line or a clause to saying, if you don't participate, this will be the outcome or whatever, but just that power dynamic that is in there was, so we realized that, and there was a group of our partners that we realized they were not participating in our activities. And so we decided, okay, what would be the best approach? So what we did was, okay, let's forget about what we have as a flagship program and ask them, just give them a blank check to design a program, design what is a challenge to them. Now, I like the fact that Rick talked about trainings and building local capacities. So what we did was give them a blank check, design a program, design a project, let us know what is the challenge, what is the solution, propose a solution. And I think we kind of shifted away from being part of the process. This was you, tell us what you want to do and tell us who would be in the best place to help you. We have a pool of experts we can recommend, but as of now, this is for you. Do it, and let's see, propose this, identify the challenge first of all, propose the solution. And that worked really well. Things that we didn't know, we learned, and that opened up the program, that brought new initiatives into the program, new ideas. So I think that learning has to, we need to know that there's knowledge everywhere. And if you are not open to that, then we'll keep singing the same song in different ways, because you will think that you have changed the song, but you are still holding on to this, I'll use this word power again, which is actually preventing people from, first of all, saying what the actual challenge is and proposing what the solution would be, because if you're not on the ground, you can only assume. So I think that assumptions,
Thank you, Nancy,
I don't know if
a practical example.
It, but
a practical example around that. So thank you. I think that's been really useful. We're just noting that quite a few questions and issues, reflections in the chat around funding issues. So the issue of, where does the money come from is key. So the angle of this question then is around how can we wean society organizations off large bilateral aid funding? And I think that I was going to maybe direct that question at Angela, if that's okay. Just raise I can't. So let me just reformulate this. Sometimes there's quite a difference between what's being talked about and then the realities on the ground around incentives embedded in the system in terms of where the money comes from. So how can we start the process of weaning civil society organizations off bilateral aid funding? Would you like to have a go at talking about that, Angela?
Okay, I'll have a go and then see maybe others also have different perspectives as well. I think that the challenge, first of all, I don't know whether it's for us to be weaning partners. I think partners are, they should be free to choose the type of funding that they get. But the reality is obviously that there are huge needs in their countries and in their communities, and so then they tend to go for whatever funding is available. I think that also in a lot of the sector now, the international NGOs are saying, how can we begin to facilitate direct access to funding from organizations, large multilateral and bilateral donors, to local actors and really our counterparts. And this is obviously an issue. And I know that, for example, there are a lot of conversations happening in Bond looking at so if that is the case, then what would be the role of the international NGO, the international NGO, and how can we reimagine a future where we're not the conduits of funding or the middlemen, if you like, because I think that is another issue, and that is also an area where INGOs do have a lot of power because they seem to be the ones that are trusted by these large organizations, and maybe we've fed this narrative as well, because we've maybe in the way that we've reported, in the way that we communicate our work, we've not necessarily provided enough credit to the local partners. I think if you see a lot of organizations, they will talk about work that they're doing in the communities when actually they're not working directly with communities, but working with local organizations. So I think for us, certainly at All We Can, it's about how can we support our partners to get to that point where they can be able to make decisions, where they can be able to say yes or no to different types of funding. And a lot of that is to do with helping them to become more financially sustainable, looking at different ways in which they can diversify their income, looking at, for example, social enterprises and IGAs, so that they're able to grow the amount of unrestricted funding that comes to them, so that they can also then be able to be more responsive to the needs that they find in the communities where they serve, and communities can truly become the drivers of their own transformation and change.
Thank you very much, Angela. I think that's a strong hitting answer. Well done. To quite a difficult question. Can
I add a follow-up point, Peter?
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah, I think, so exactly as Angela said, and also I think where there's opportunities in some countries, particularly middle-income countries, tapping into new streams of corporate social responsibility funding, for example, can be really a great opportunity for national organisations to tap into rather than looking externally. So that piece around domestic resource mobilisation is really important. And I've also seen organisations like USAID fund work, for example, in Moldova, to help create a culture of philanthropy. So it's trying to build that culture within a country of people giving to charities, and that can be another part of the puzzle.
Great, thank you very much, Lucy. In fact, there's a question here that I was just going to actually formulate for you, Lucy. Maybe you can start off. It's actually quite a broad question, and there may be others who want to chip in on this one as well. So clearly, we're talking about shifting the power here. And the question or the comments that we've had in the chat around how do we ensure that this is not just another fashion, a thing that's the flavor of the month in international development. It's a bandwagon that we're all jumping on, and there'll be another one down the road. So what is it that's different, and how do we ensure that this is about making fundamental lasting change?
A great question. My instinct is it's not just another flash in the pan. I think there's too much. I think there's a critical mass now of people and organizations that care about this, that are doing something about it, that have, I think, seen the impact of kind of existing paradigms and ways of working, the negative impact that's having. And I think particularly the Black Lives Matter movement has really helped to tip the balance. So I think my sense is it's it's an unstoppable wave, like it's inevitable. But I think what we can all do individually, and I often take it back to what's within my direct control. So what are the things I'm noticing that I'm not speaking up about, and actually deciding consciously to say something. If I see something that I disagree with or just doesn't sit right with me, I say something about it. And I think if all of us take responsibility for that, you know, that's what we can immediately do. And then I think there are other things, you know, for example, helping partners to have those conversations with, you know, with their other international partners, for example. I think something that INTRAC is doing through the training is that we're really kind of pushing this message when it comes to partner capacity strengthening, of local ownership, of, you know, basically designing support around the needs of an organisation rather than imposing support from the outside. So I think it's up to all of us, and I think it's for partners to speak up, but I think it's inevitable.
Right, thank you very much, Lucy. I don't know if there's anyone else on the panel who wanted to share a comment or thought on that question.
I mean, I suppose, you know, the language might change, but for me, the principle has been there, you know, since INTRAC started. You know, that's been my engagement. And so, yes, the term might shift, but actually that fundamental understanding of how change takes place, what development is, isn't going to change. And also, as Lucy said, and I think Leonard also mentioned in the chat, was, you know, it is quite challenging on a personal level. You can sort of talk about it in ideological terms or with programs, but it does come back to you, and when you speak, when you don't speak, and ego and all of those other things, and maybe the unlearning that Nancy spoke about. It's yeah, it's easy to speak about, but actually it's personally deeply challenging.
Thank you, Rick. I'm just being prodded by the people in the background telling us that actually we, on a time question, we should probably move forward. So thank you very much for everyone's questions. I know we haven't had a chance to answer all of your questions. We will collect these, and we're going to find a way of feeding back at the end of the event back to everybody. So for now, what we'd like to do, as we planned, is to go into breakout groups. These are going to be small groups, 5 or 6 people. So please put your cameras back on and put your microphones back on when you're in your groups. There's a link that's going to be put in the chat, and that link is really for you to, where you'll see 3 questions that will direct your thinking and conversation. It's actually a link to a page where everyone's going to have access to. So what you might find is that when you're putting various thoughts down, someone's already put it. So in which case you can put a thumbs up and like their comment if you wish, in which case it puts it higher up to the top of the list. But please feel free to add your thoughts and comments. Really interested to hear what you've got to say. And we suggest that at the beginning of your breakout group is you may be tempted to have a long introduction for each other. It's a very good idea to have an introduction, but I would urge you to keep that quite short so that you can go into the meat and of the meaty questions that we've got there for you to look at. So those questions, can I just check with my team looking for nods? It's actually on the link that we're going to get the questions rather than anywhere else. That's right. So you have to click on that link to find the questions. And they're also putting them in the chat just prior to you going into the breakout group. So I think without further ado, I think we can go into our breakout groups. See you on the other side. Welcome back, everybody. I can see that's in the online board there. There's lots of rich comments and discussions that you must have had to be able to record those thoughts there. So thank you very much for that. I hope that was useful. I hope it was interesting to share in a smaller group some thoughts about the presentations and your own practical experiences too. So what we're going to do now is just have a flavor of those conversations and discussions by hearing back from 5 people, and we've asked those 5 individuals to be quite brief in their feedback of those discussions. So there's a challenge there probably in itself. But obviously very interested to hear what has been shared. So I think we're going to start off doing those straight away. So Paul, can I ask you to kick us off?
Yes, thanks, Peter, and thanks everybody. It's been a really interesting discussion so far, and we had a very good discussion too in our group. There was a couple of issues that came up, which I just want to reflect on, which I think were quite strong in the question and answers, and that came out in the panel. The first one was about funding. We talked about funding, and basically, if we want to shift power, we need unrestricted funding. I think that was the feeling, that it's very challenging if we have more restrictive funding modalities. And it feels that money and power are they're very much linked together. So without addressing that, it's going to be very difficult to fully shift power. There's a very interesting point about how to strike a balance between supporting local organizations to access funding on the one hand, bearing in mind that at the moment it's very much sort of still northern traditional donors, which have their own political agendas. So how do you keep that balance about providing funding in a way that's sort of accessible and maybe not so restrictive, but also allowing them to keep their core identity and to respond to and reflect the kind of individual contexts that the organizations operate in? So that was one of our points. The second one, very quickly, was about sort of leadership and consultants, reflecting, I think, on what Rick was talking about and some of the points in the chat. So it's very difficult to identify the right people, and it's a sort of question that's being asked not just from the outside but sometimes internally as well. It's a very big challenge. What do they need to bring to the role? What are the kind of the sort of capacities that they have? And there's a whole amount of stakeholders that need to be worked with in these roles. Trust is a very important thing, and we also felt that there is no one size fits all. So it shouldn't be a case that we sort of try and impose ideas across different contexts. It's very much linked to the context and the sort of differing ambitions that organizations have. That came out very strongly, that some organizations have different ambitions to others, and that we shouldn't be thinking that an OD consultant, for example, is a mirror of what an OD consultant might look like in another organization. So that was it. And just a final point, sorry, I'm going a little bit far. In terms of actions, what can we do? It came out quite strongly in kind of the idea of commitment to long term. We need these longer term commitments and partnerships. We need a commitment to change. International organizations in particular need to analyze ourselves and ask ourselves a lot of very difficult questions about what exactly we mean and how we can shift the power, and what ourselves, we are part of the problem sometimes. So anyway, I'll just leave it there and say thanks for a really, really good discussion.
Great, thank you very much, Paul. Lots to talk about there. And maybe we can move straight on then to another group. Lizel, I'm going to ask you to feedback from your group, please.
Thank you, Peter. So in my group, there is Jared, there's Corey in London, and there's Rachel also in the UK. So in terms of our reflections, first of all, we think that letting go of power is not easy for international actors, according to Corey. Rachel says that I think it's important to think of shifting the power at an individual level. So it's not about, when we think of shifting the power, like in the big context, I think we need to start at the individual level in terms of how we understand power, and which links to what Jared emphasized, that when we think of, again, shifting the power and taking action, every small step is important. We would be able to shift that power through small steps and not necessarily through big steps at once. I think there's a big agreement among our group that it's important to have genuine partnership, openness, and trust to make this possible. We also recognize that language is quite important in our effort to shift the power. So we looked at the phrase capacity development, moving into the new phrase capacity strengthening. But now there's, Corey's mentioned that they use capacity sharing in recognition of the capacity of all actors wherever they are. So we recognize this is quite a radical term to recognize that everybody is bringing something to the table. I think that's a key reflections for my group.
Right, thank you very much, Liesl. Language is very important and definitely speaks to what some of the panel said, particularly what Nancy was saying around that too. Thank you. So I'm going to, without further ado, move on to another group. So Alison, if I can ask you to feedback from your group, please.
Great, thanks, Peter. Yes, we had quite a small little group, which was nice, gave us time to chat. So some of the key points that came out, one thing that struck people from the presentation was the idea of consulting with soul, that it's not just about the money, but about transformation, both of the consultant and of the organization. So where the consultant listens, lets go of power and encourages ownership. So that was seen as you know, an opportunity, but recognizing that the way that the system is set up at the moment really supports existing power dynamics, even to the extent of, while we're well-intentioned, the donors just do not give enough time or recognize the time required for capacity development, the time that's needed for that, and prioritizing time for that. So that makes it difficult when there's no time for reflection, and no time often to think about how to do things differently, how to approach things differently, let alone the funding issue, which we also discussed as well. And I think one of the other, we also discussed the issue of language, that there are sort of neo-colonialist sort of connotations even with the phrase capacity development. One of the participants gave the example where they're trying to do grant making differently, even in terms of changing the language from capacity development or OD to accompaniment. So not being a capacity builder, but being an accompanier, and changing the language, but also changing how that organizational development is done through accompaniment rather than as a one-off or top-down kind of approach. And just recognizing that language itself, the language of English, for example, can carry a lot of power dynamics. So these were some of the key points that we discussed.
Great, thank you very much, Alison. You might have a small group, but good conversation by the sounds of things. I'm going to move straight on to Alistair. Would you mind feeding back from your group, please?
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, so we had a really interesting discussion on a lot of the things that have already been picked up, but a few other things as well. So one of the things that came through quite strongly in the comments as well, I think, was the need to, in order to shift power, there's a need to sort of move away from partnerships that are specifically results or outcome oriented, and that this needs to be stressed more specifically when we speak with international NGOs and agencies. And this sort of fed into some of the discussion as well around potentially some of the challenges. So around the gatekeepers, there's often an assumption that these are good people, so they don't need inspection. But then that inherently brings with it problems. And then tied to that, there's also sort of a central question of who individuals or organizations realistically ever want to give up power themselves, which cuts across the whole topic. We also had some tied to that, some interesting discussions on the language as well. So similar to what Alison mentioned, and one of the participants in the group talked about how they've been using, instead of shift power, instead they've been using expand power. And this isn't just a slightly sort of more egalitarian, I guess, approach to that, but also a mind shift in that it moves away from the idea of one party having to give up something and instead it's a more sort of positive spin in that it's about sort of sharing or expanding, and organizations can actually sort of feel threatened by the idea of shift. They see it as potentially as a loss and can get defensive. So working to counteract that as well. And yeah, we had lots of other things as well, but I shall pause.
Great, thank you very much, Alistair. Some overlap there with the other groups too, but also some new thoughts emerging. And finally, I'm just going to turn to Rod for feedback from your group, please.
Thank you very much. It's very hard to say anything hasn't already been said at this point. But from our group, we discussed about the consultants in the Global South, and that COVID has given an opportunity in a way for people to show what they could do, and that showed what is possible rather than sending people internationally. And I think we were impressed by the people on the panel showing there are people who are very well able to identify, analyze, and challenge power dynamics within the system. At the same time, we saw challenges that it's often difficult to find a lot of OD consultants in particular contexts in the Global South. It's quite hard for them to sustain themselves in that kind of work. And there's a question about how much their knowledge is actually valued, which is referred to by one of the other groups. So it's more emphasis on developing and supporting more consultants in the Global South. And that's linked to the question of funding, which a number of others have mentioned. But I was impressed by the presentation about where you can invest in an organization's strategy with a lot of emphasis on OD, not just on project results, but that does depend on flexible funding, and awful lot of aid is not flexible. So what we need to do is, one, influence donors to provide fund more flexible, with more flexibility. And INTRAC has found more experience with foundations recently than maybe more than institutional donors. There's maybe more scope there. And secondly, promoting resource mobilization in country, which then means that local organizations and the way they use consultants doesn't depend on the international aid system.
Great, thank you very much, Rod. It all seems to come back to trying to find lots of practical, proactive ways for helping to think through new approaches or new language or new perspectives to actually make a difference and to demonstrate that difference in a practical way. Okay, so we are at our final stage. I'd like to ask Smruti to get ready to share her concluding remarks with us. Just as she's getting ready to do that, if I could ask everyone to be ready to click on a link that will be put into the chat shortly, because what we'd like to do is to create a word cloud, and we're going to invite you to put 3 words on the link, and as everyone puts their words in, a cloud should form, and I'd like you to do this as Smruti is speaking rather than wait till the end, so that by the time we get to the end of our session today, we will have actually had a way of summarizing what's foremost in people's minds. So I think that's going to be added into the chat right now, and maybe this is a really good moment to hand straight over to Smruti.
Thank you, and what an honor, but also difficult job. There's been such rich discussions and really impressive coming from different perspectives. I think what really strikes me and really important, and it keeps coming back, is people, right? So it's all about individuals who can make a difference, individuals who can help others to make a difference. But what both Angela and Nancy also were saying is that unless we reflect individually on our own power first, it's very hard to shift other power, because you have to really make sure you understand where you're coming from and then go from that space to being able to help others. I think the second one that really stood out to me is about time, that it takes time. It's not something that can be done overnight. And the language we're using and over time, right, is so important, how it's understood. and also how we portray things and then how it is interpreted by others. There was a lot of emphasis on funding, that it's the money that's making the power dynamics. But I also heard other aspects that it's about how we behave, our attitudes and behaviors in terms of how we deal with people, the relations, right? Was a really important aspect. And I think what Rick said at the beginning about, what kind of commitment are we coming with in terms of our own way, again, going back to the individuals, right? In terms of what is our calling, what are we there to do, and how we are actually supporting, rather than, I think the language thing that came up was around capacity building and capacity strengthening, but actually capacity sharing and expanding capacity was, those words are really, really important. I think the other thing that really stood out for me was really this song that we've been singing this song for a long time. But actually, as the time goes past, are we using new verses of the song, right? Are we changing the song slightly? And it's this thing about small steps that we take makes the change as well. We may not see it, but it takes time. And I think really for me, what stood out from Angela was really that sometimes we don't see change immediately and we give up. But actually, if we persevere, and if we carry on digging away at it, then it's going to happen and we will see it. It might be small, but when you see it over time, it's actually quite a big change. I think the big thing for me is around, and I think that the thing about the attitude, with what are you coming? Humbleness was one of the words. I thought that was a really important word to say. And about learning and growing together. And it's not about us and them. We are not, the ones expanding them or capacitating them, and that you're learning together and growing together. That's really important. Lucy talked about this whole new aspect, the digital part, right? And how that is changing the space. And also in some ways horizontalizing the space. More local partners and actors can join into the conversations, are able to access things that they would not be able to before. But then we also have to be very careful that we don't leave the ones who don't have digital access behind. So there's a real careful balance, right, in terms of what we can do with real making sure that inclusion, and I think Nancy talked about this as well, inclusion is so key if we really want real change and a real shift. A lot of talk about also decolonization. And I want to go back to the language, how decolonization is perceived by people, both at international level and how we talk about it, but also actually at local level, how is that perceived and talked about as well? Really key thing. But I have this image, the bulldozer, right, Lucy? And that digital bulldozer. And I thought the other part was the change. And I think in one of the discussions about COVID, and what changes that brought, and suddenly we started doing things differently. We had to, right? So in a way, maybe the bottom up also demand the change from bottom is also making us think in a different way. And I hope that will help us to continue to look at the shifts and the change that are needed. And it is a long-term thing. But I think not to focus too much on the funding, because funding is important, but we also heard if we ensure that we work with the solutions coming from the partners and give them the space and the enabling environment, they actually can do quite a lot. And we have to give them that, acknowledge that as well. I think all these things are shifting power. And we can see some of the practices happening, and there are others. I think some would say there's a long way to go. But those baby steps that are being taken are really, really important. I think if you can, I would say one thing that needs to be focused, and I think this is overall, think about the power first, always reflect personally, and it's the people who make a difference. Systems are made of people, right? And we always must focus on the people, and first our reflection on power, and then only we can shift things. And I just want to leave it at that. Peter, over back to you.
Great, thank you very much, Smruti. That's been really helpful to get your thoughts and reflections back to us on the whole event. So really, we're bringing the whole thing to a conclusion now. I think we can see the word cloud with all the words that people have shared. It's still forming, I think. So thank you very much for doing that. Just wanted to clarify quickly some next steps that we're going to be taking, so that we want to make sure that this event was part of the conversation around shifting the power, part of the journey. So we're going to make a small video from the presenters from today, and we're going to do a write-up of the feedback, and we'll share that more widely. And also just to say that we're going to have another event similar to this in a few months' time about shifting the power through monitoring, evaluation and learning in June. So watch this space for that too. Thank you everyone so much for your contributions, participation, engagement with this. It's been fantastic, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Many thanks. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.